And today we're going to be reading There's Something Wrong with Either My Neighbor or Me, which is by PleaseStopWatchingMe on Reddit. And I read the story a while back, and I thought it was really cool. And I got the go-ahead to do it for my channel, so we're going to try it. People say that the first step is admitting you have a problem. And people, I'm here to say that I have a problem. Whether it's a real one or something that's just between my ears is up to you. In other words, I'm asking for your opinion. I'm asking if my paranoia is misplaced or not. It all started yesterday. Recently we got a new neighbor and my mother decided to bake him a pie as a welcome to the neighborhood. An apple pie to be more exact. She decided that I, the recent university graduate without a job, was the perfect candidate to deliver said pie. And since I didn't do much around the house other than a few chores, I thought it was fair. So with said pie, I walked over to the house across the street. But the second my eyes landed on that house, something felt wrong. At that moment, I blamed it on being nervous, as I never got used to meeting new people. But because I promised my mother, I decided to shake off the feeling of uneasiness. As I got closer to the house, the feeling of dread wouldn't leave my stomach. But as soon as I stood at the front of the lawn, curiosity got added to the mix. Apparently the phrase, "the grass is always greener on the other side," is true, because I've never seen grass that was more green than this. It was almost cartoony. It also made all the other lawns on the street look worse than they actually were. Apparently I stood still for too long because the door opened, and with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes stood my new neighbor. If I had to describe him in one word, it would be generic. But even that wouldn't be quite right. The man who stood in front of me was so generic that he would stand out in a crowd. I know that it doesn't make sense, but let me try. You know the phrase, "so bad that it's good"? Well, the man in front of me was the living embodiment of the phrase, "so generic that it's unique." "How can I help you, pal?" His cheerfulness in his voice sounded so fake. As if he practiced that line until it was perfect. But perfect doesn't happen in real life. Only in movies. My mother baked you a pie to welcome you to the neighborhood, sir." I held up the pie in front of me, hoping that he would accept the pie so I could leave. But that was wishful thinking, as there were at least 12 feet between us. The man let out a chuckle before he shook his head. "No need to call me sir, pal. The name is Norman Smith." He started to walk towards me, and I don't remember a moment in my life that I felt more nervous. In fact, the genericness of his name didn't register with me because I was so nervous. But it was misplaced, as all he did was take the pie out of my hands before he gave me a handshake. "It's a pleasure to meet you." The last word was drawn out as if he was asking for my name. "Jeremy." "It's nice to meet you, Jeremy." He placed an arm around my shoulder. If I wasn't such a scaredy cat, I might have said something, or even just brush off his arm, but I did neither, and I still regret it. I was about to make up an excuse so I could leave, but unfortunately he was faster than I was. He invited me in for a piece of pie, saying that it would be too much for one person and that he didn't want to waste it. I admit what follows next is probably my fault, as I accepted his offer. But what can I say other than that being a scaredy cat and being curious aren't mutually exclusive? It didn't take long for me to regret it, though. Just a mere couple of seconds. The second he opened the door, in fact. He still had his arm around me, but because we didn't fit through the door like that, he gently pushed me through the door first. Another wave of dread washed over me. Since there was no entry hall, we stood directly in the living room. It was perfect. Way too perfect. It was the opposite of a haunted house, but still just as creepy. Everything was clean and it almost seemed to shine, as if it was a dollhouse instead of a house for a human being. I could swear that I was just staring for a couple of seconds, but when I looked back, the door was closed. And when I looked at the table, Norman was already sitting with a plate of pie in front of him and another in front of the chair at the opposite end of the table. With a gesture, he pointed for me to sit, which I regrettably did. When I sat down, something started to dawn on me. How could he afford this house? He didn't look much older than me, perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s. It was hard to tell, but what wasn't hard to tell was that this house wasn't cheap. Being in a fairly good neighborhood and all, but at the moment I had other things to worry about, like how he didn't break eye contact. I remember reading somewhere that when someone holds eye contact for longer than 6 seconds, it either meant the desire for sex or murder. It's probably not true, but it was the first thing I could think of when I realized he didn't look away. Every time I tried to say something, it was almost as if my mouth refused to open. I could think of the words I wanted to say or even yell, but my mouth refused to. I was never good with crowds, but I didn't know It was even worse when that crowd was just one person staring at you intensely. But somehow I mustered up the courage to quickly eat the piece of pie in front of me, as if that was the only thing that kept me here. The entire time I kept my eyes on the plate, but I could still feel his eyes on me. Once I was done, I looked up, only to see he ate his piece too. Another wave of uneasiness washed over me as I was sure that the only sound in the room of someone eating was me. He was either the neatest eater in the world or something was wrong. "Let me bring this into the kitchen," said a voice suddenly next to me. To my surprise, it was Norman, who was holding his plate. Without thinking, I grabbed his plate and fork out of his hands. The result was genuine surprise from the fakest person I've ever met. Let me clean this up for you." It was part nerves that drove me to offer it and part curiosity. I couldn't help but wonder if every part of his house was as perfect as a living room. Before I could reject my offer, I picked up my plate and fork and practically jumped out of my seat. "I insist," I said as I entered the kitchen. To my surprise, he didn't follow, but as expected, the kitchen was as perfect as the living room. I placed the plates in the sink and felt the little courage I had sink to the ground. For a while, I contemplated just sprinting out of the house to safety, but since I said I would clean, I thought that I should at least do that. With one hand on the knob, I was about to turn it when I noticed a hand on holding the sink that definitely wasn't mine. As slow as a snail, I turned around only to be greeted by Norman with his toothy smile. "Is everything all right?" he asked while standing way too close to me. That and the fact that I wasn't all right made me quickly nod my head. And I finally did what I should have done way earlier. I left. I stepped to the side that wasn't blocked by his arm before stepping backward so my back was facing the door. "It was very nice, but I have to go now." And without letting him say goodbye, I left the kitchen with a slam before I literally sprinted out of the house. I'm not sure if the fact that there were knives in the kitchen was what made me leave, but I'm glad I did. I didn't stop running until I was inside my house, and I didn't calm down until I double-locked the door. Fortunately, both my parents were home, so that was possible. For the rest of the afternoon, I locked myself in my room. I was trying to make sense of what had just happened. Out of the window of my bedroom, I stared at the too-perfect house across the street. I noticed that I could look in what seemed to be his bedroom, so I quickly closed my curtains. If I could see his bedroom, there was no doubt that he could see mine. Apparently, I fell asleep because I woke up to the smell of dinner. With sleep still in my eyes, I dragged myself downstairs. "Do you have any plans tonight, sweetie?" asked my mother from the dining room. At the same time, I heard the doorbell ring, so I turned to open it. "No, I don't," I answered, and when I opened the door, I instantly regretted it. With the same toothy smile, the same red tie and blue suit that wouldn't look out of place in the 50s, stood my neighbor. "Nice to see you, Jeremy," he said with his infinite smile. Luckily, my mother showed up to greet him, and I quickly left to the dining room. I knew that hiding in my room wasn't an option, and because I just said I didn't have plans, I couldn't pretend that I did. But since my parents would be there, I figured that he had to say something instead of just staring at me. Unfortunately, I was wrong. Very wrong. This had to be the most uncomfortable dinner I ever had in my entire life. I knew it the second he sat down across from me. His eyes never left mine and never touched his food. But the weirdest part was that my parents didn't acknowledge it. They were talking to each other as if nothing was wrong. Meanwhile, I was so uncomfortable I could barely hear what they were saying. All I could do was push the spaghetti around on my plate, because every time I looked up, I could see blue eyes staring back at me. I made the mistake of trying to do the same, because the second he noticed what I was doing, his smile widened. But not in a friendly way. In fact, I don't think I could describe it to you. Despite physical evidence that proved the contrary, it felt like we were the only ones in the room. It felt terrible. It was so bad, I almost didn't notice my mother pick up my plate. But when I saw it, I felt more confused than scared. I knew that I didn't eat my food, and neither did he. But both of our plates were empty. It reminded me of what happened earlier today. The rest of the evening was just as bad. While my parents were talking and eating their dessert, I was just staring at mine, trying to keep my mind off the feeling of being watched. Luckily, I wasn't stupid enough to try to win a staring game with him again. However, I did do it with my dessert. I kept my eyes on it the entire time. But when my mother picked it up, I looked at her to tell her I wasn't finished. But before I did, I saw that the bowl was now empty. With wide eyes, I just sat there for a while. What brought me out of my thoughts was the sound of the front door opening. When I looked up, I saw I was the only one sitting at the dinner table. I didn't leave the dining room until I could hear the front door close again. With wide eyes, I walked to the living room where I saw my parents watch TV. "What do you think of him?" I asked, my voice barely louder than a whisper. "Him? Oh, you mean Norman?" My mother asked before she smiled. "He's such a charming guy. Funny, too." She laughed as if she remembered a joke. My father nodded in agreement, and quoted the joke Norman supposedly said during dinner. A joke I knew Norman couldn't have said, as he was too busy staring at me all evening. The joke would have been funny in other circumstances, but the only thing I could say was a muttered okay. Before I could lock myself in my room, my mother said, "Oh, I promised that you would show him around the city tomorrow. That's not a problem, is it?" Just another thing I knew he didn't say. But it wasn't something I could talk myself out of. That's the downside of being the only one in your circle without a job. My parents knew that my friends wouldn't be available until next week, and I wasn't one to go out by myself. I answered with a muttered sure, and that seemed to be enough for her. Slowly I walked to my room before locking it. Luckily I had my own bathroom and a bag of chips in my room, so maybe I could lock myself in it. It was a wishful thought because despite my closed curtain, I could feel blue eyes watching me. Please tell me, Reddit, I'm not insane, am I? Now that is the story. There's something wrong with either my neighbor or me. So props to the author, Please Stop Watching Me. The link to the story will be in the description, along with all of my social media, so go check all of that out, and goodbye guys.